Hey everybody, welcome back to another day. Glad that it's Friday today, and I know you guys are. So hopefully you guys are having a good Friday, and it's gonna be a great weekend. Let's dive on in. We are talking about the skeptic theories of the resurrection. Remember, we are trying to examine evidence for or against the resurrection of Jesus to see what kind of evidence is out there for that. And so we talked about the importance of the resurrection a couple weeks ago and reviewed it at the beginning of this week. And then the three big pieces of evidence for the resurrection are the empty tomb, the appearances by the resurrected Jesus. You know, all these people saw and some even touched and heard Jesus. And then the apostles or disciples, their willingness to die for that message of the truth of the resurrection. And so those are the three big pieces of evidence for the resurrection. But then, so how do people answer that? How do people answer or have a reason for the empty tomb that is not the resurrection? So if you don't believe in the resurrection, you would be a skeptic. So what are the theories that people put out there as to how to answer this evidence? And so yesterday, or for you guys Wednesday, you talked about three of those skeptic theories about the resurrection. The hallucination theory says that the disciples or apostles and all these people didn't really see Jesus after his resurrection. They just hallucinated him or hallucinated meeting him. And then we talked about the wrong tomb theory, that it was not Jesus's tomb that they found empty, but it was simply a different tomb. They went to the wrong one. That's why the tomb was empty. And then we also talked about the swoon theory. Some people call it the apparent death theory, meaning Jesus did not really die. He just appeared to die, right? But he really just swooned or went unconscious, passed out on the cross. And so when they took him off the cross and put him in the tomb, he wasn't really dead. Therefore, he woke back up a few days later instead of coming back alive a few days later. So those are the three we talked about so far. And yesterday we gave, to me, compelling reasons why none of those three are as good, make as much sense as the resurrection. So today I want us to look at three more. You should have another worksheet there with you today. And so you can write on the worksheet there the name of the theory, what that theory says, and then we'll pause the video and give you guys a few minutes to either write down or discuss how would you answer that theory. If you were talking to a friend, how would you answer them bringing that theory up? And so give you a few minutes to that, and then we'll come back to the video and I'll give you my reasons for that and then move on to the next one. Okay? So, skeptic theory, which will be number 4 for us, is called the pagan myth theory. The pagan myth theory. And this theory simply says that the New Testament writers, the guys who are writing the story of the resurrection down, made the whole thing up. That they were simply copying stories similar to the resurrection from other pagan myths, from other pagan beliefs, right? That the resurrection didn't really happen, that the people who wrote about it, which would have been your four gospel writers, Paul wrote about it, Peter, I believe, may have wrote about it as well. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, there were multiple guys that wrote writings in the New Testament that talked about the resurrection, and this theory says they just made all that up. They stole the idea from other stories, from other pagan myths, and then they wrote about it and made it seem like this is really what happened. So that's the pagan myth theory. So take just a few minutes, pause the video here, and come up with reasons why you would argue against this theory. What would you say to a friend who brought this theory up to you? So pause the video now. All right, I hope you came up with a few good reasons why you argue against this theory, why this may not be the best theory for the evidence. A couple that I have. One, as we saw a few weeks ago when we talked about the historical reliability of the New Testament, it is anything but a mythological writing. It is anything but a group of writings that you couldn't trust, right? You can trust the New Testament historically is what I'm talking about. There is plenty of evidence that the New Testament is a historically reliable document. So to then just throw in there and say, no, they made all this up, that doesn't fit with what we saw, all the evidence for the historical reliability of the New Testament. So that's a strike against this theory. But also, there's some big pieces of evidence that just don't line up with this theory. One would be the empty tomb, right? Why was the tomb empty if they just made it all up? Okay. Two, the willingness to die of the apostles. If they really made this up, if they stole the idea from other pagan myths and just made the whole thing up, why in the world would they die for it? And not just die for it, but undergo intense persecution, right? We heard in the video we watched a couple weeks ago where John, the apostle, was boiled in a vat of oil. I mean, come on, right? Like, as soon as I'm sitting over this vat of oil, they're about to dump me in it. Like, I'm about to say, whoa, 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 stop. I made the whole thing up, right? But John didn't do that. None of the apostles did, right? They didn't go back on their story. So that leads us to believe that they didn't make it up. And then also, what about the testimony of non-Christian people, right? We've seen this. The guy named Josephus, he was a Jewish historian, wasn't a Christian, and he even wrote about the apostles claiming the resurrection happening. Right, so there's all kinds of, I think, things you could say against this theory. And again, this isn't a really commonly used one. People do throw it out there, right, that they just made the whole thing up. But I think there's plenty of evidence against this theory. All right, so skeptic theory number 5 for us is what is known as the substitute theory. The substitute theory. This is one of the more common theories, probably. I'd say either the most common or maybe second most common theory out of all 6 of these that people use today. The substitute theory says that it was not really Jesus on the cross, that they put someone else up there who looked exactly like Jesus, but it wasn't really him. So this imposter or this substitute, which is where the name comes from, died on the cross. They buried this guy. And then, boom, 3 days later, the real Jesus shows back up and is walking around. And then the disciples or apostles are able to say, look, everybody, Jesus came back alive. But it wasn't really Jesus there. This is a very common theory in the religion of Islam. Check this quote out from the Quran, right, which is the holy book of Islam. It says this: they killed him, Jesus, not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them. Nay, Allah raised him up unto himself. Right? So the Muslims don't believe that Jesus really died on the cross and that he was then resurrected. And so, again, a very common belief here. In fact, a lot of Muslims think that they used Judas Iscariot. If you know the story of the Gospels, Judas was one of the disciples of Jesus who betrayed Jesus, who got Jesus arrested. A lot of Muslims believe they put Judas on the cross, right? And he was the one who really died. So take just a few minutes, again, pause the video and talk about how would you answer this theory if somebody brought it up to you. All right, maybe you were able to come up with a few things. A couple of things I'll mention on this one. One, there really isn't any evidence for this. There's plenty of evidence for the resurrection, but not really for this, the idea that they would have swapped somebody. But probably a better answer to this was, could all of the people who were present at the cross, including Jesus' followers, one, but the Roman soldiers, guards, leaders, the Jewish leaders, right? All these people who had seen Jesus for years now, who had been around Jesus, especially the last few days as they were beating Jesus and had him on trial and all this kind of stuff. Like, they knew what Jesus looked like, and the fact that they would not have recognized that it was a different person on the cross, I think would have it doesn't make a whole bunch of sense, right? It doesn't, at least to me, it doesn't make as good a sense as the truth of the resurrection. But then you still have to ask the question, well, why was the tomb empty? Right? We're going to almost, if you use the substitute theory, you have to pair it with another theory, which we'll talk about in just a second. But again, and we keep coming back to this because it's, again, such good evidence, it still doesn't answer the question of why were the disciples willing to die for it, right? So if the substitute theory were true, either the disciples knew it was a substitute, right, and they lied about the whole resurrection thing. But again, why were they willing to die for it if they knew it was a lie? If they knew they made the whole thing up, they knew the whole plan, and they were still willing to die for it, that doesn't make sense. So maybe the disciples didn't know the plan. Maybe they didn't know that there was a substitute on the cross. That means you're telling me that for 3 years, these disciples lived, walked, talked, were around Jesus constantly for 3 years. They knew Jesus better than anybody in the whole world. And they would have been able to be fooled by who was hanging on the cross. I'm not buying that. There's no way. There's no way the disciples would have been fooled into really thinking that was Jesus on the cross if it really wasn't. Right? So it makes more sense that they were part of the plan, that they knew about what was going on if it was a substitute. But then again, they wouldn't have been willing to die for something they knew was a lie. So again, poking holes all in this. The substitute theory, honestly, it's one of the better ones out of some of these theories. But still, it doesn't make as much sense as the resurrection does when you examine the evidence. And again, and I've said this a lot in this class, that's what this is all about. It's here's the evidence. Here are possible answers or possible conclusions of this evidence. And it's up to you and me to figure out which we think is the most likely. And so, again, is the substitute theory possible for the evidence? Sure. But is it the best explanation of the evidence? I don't believe so at all. At all. Okay? So that was theory 5, the substitute theory. Last one, theory 6. And for me, this is the one that, out of all 6, I guess would be the best one. Maybe. So theory 6 is the stolen body theory. The stolen body theory. And of course, as the name implies, this theory says that the disciples stole the body of Jesus from the tomb and then claimed that he had resurrected. Okay. Now, this is a theory that you would probably pair with several of the others. You could pair this one with the substitute theory, right? It was a substitute on the cross, and then they stole that substitute's body and then claimed that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. Even the wrong tomb theory, right? They stole the body, maybe not. The hallucination theory, maybe. They stole his body and then they had this hallucination. So several of the theories you could probably put this theory with. But this theory says they stole the body of Jesus from the tomb and then either lied about it or hallucinated about it, whatever. Most people would say they lied about it. They made it up, right? Again, pairing it with the pagan myth theory. They stole the story from these pagan myths. They stole the body from Jesus, or stole the body of Jesus from the tomb, and then made up the whole story. Okay, so take a few minutes. Why would you say this does not make sense? So pause the video here and share some ideas. All right. I really think there are multiple answers to this potential theory, multiple holes you can poke in it. One is the one we've mentioned on almost every single one of these theories. If the disciples knew that it was a lie, knew that the resurrection was this made-up story, they stole the body, Jesus is really dead, and they just made this whole thing up to give themselves power, to create this movement to fool people, then why were they willing to die for that truth? Right? Why were they willing to endure intense persecution and then horrible, painful deaths for something they knew was a lie? They wouldn't have. Nobody does that. Somebody out of those guys, if not most of those guys, would have come clean when they were faced with death for this whole thing. There's no way that would have happened. So that's a big one. And then 2, think about the nature of a lie, right? I mean, we've all lied lots of times, right? Some of us have probably been caught in, maybe big lies. The nature of lies is once you tell the first one, what do you have to keep on doing after that to make the first lie seem true? You have to keep on lying. You have to keep on making things up so that the first lie doesn't fall apart. Unfortunately, that's very difficult to do, or I should say, probably fortunately, that's a very difficult thing to do. The bigger the lie, the more smaller lies afterwards you have to tell and keep track of, right? You think of like a murder investigation, right? There's no telling how many murder investigations or just crimes in general have been solved and found out because the suspect or the whoever was guilty lied about it first, but then eventually messed up in their story, their web of lies, and then they were caught because of that. The same thing could have been said of the resurrection if the disciples were lying about it. To think that they could have made such a huge lie, like that's a huge deal. This whole story, and I know it's hard for us to grasp that because we're not during that, like we're not living during that moment during that moment in time. But this was a big deal. This was a big deal, and the Jerusalem was a big city, and this story of the resurrection had a massive effect on the whole of Jerusalem, and then after that, the whole of the Roman Empire. And then think today, Christianity is, you could argue the most dominant religion on the world, the most popular, the most widespread religion in the world. All of that to be based on a lie. That's a big lie. But then to think that the disciples could have continued weaving that web of lies, right? Keeping all their stories the same, all sharing the same lies, sharing the same details that they've all made up, and that it wouldn't have fallen apart at some point is just hard to believe, right? And again, you're not talking about just one person lying either. You're talking about a group of at least 12 guys, right? And then not to mention all these, remember Jesus is supposed to have appeared to 500 people, right? And so you're going to get 500 of those people involved in the lie too. That's not going to work. There's no way that a lie that big and that widespread holds up without somebody messing up or somebody spilling the beans and telling the truth, right? There's just that just doesn't make sense. That's not plausible. Doesn't make sense there. 2 or 3, actually, another piece of evidence on this. Remember at the tomb was not just sitting out there by itself, kind of in the middle of nowhere, nobody around. It's not that they could have just snuck up there in the middle of the night when nobody's there, because there were Roman guards guarding the tomb. All right, if you read the Gospels, it said the Romans put guards to guard the tomb because they feared that the disciples might come tamper or steal the body, right? Or somebody might mess with the grave or the tomb. So they put Roman guards up there. And these would not have just been like what we think of like mall security guys. You guys seen like Paul Blart Mall Cop, funny movie. You didn't have Paul Blart hanging out there at Jesus' tomb, right? That just, although Paul Blart was an awesome mall cop. You had these elite trained soldiers in the Roman army who would have been guarding this tomb. And the penalty for failure for these Roman soldiers would have been intense, possibly even death, right? So to think that the disciples could have gotten past these elite Roman soldiers, is pretty difficult to believe. So that's another hole there. And then lastly, again, all these eyewitnesses, and I mentioned this already, the 12 apostles plus some other followers, women of followers of Jesus, and then 500 people at one time. What was that? Was that like a Jesus lookalike? Right? Probably not. Was it all these people lying about it? I'd say most definitely not. So again, the stolen body theory probably makes the most sense out of all of these compared to the rest of these, but it still doesn't make sense of the evidence as much as the actual resurrection does. If we are examining this evidence, the best explanation for the evidence here is that Jesus really was resurrected, that he really did die on the cross, that he was buried in a tomb, and that 3 days later that tomb was found empty. And then over 500 people in the next few weeks claimed to have experienced and seen and touched and heard the resurrected Jesus. And then that those apostles and those followers of Jesus were willing to die for that message, for that belief that Jesus really was resurrected from the dead. Right? So again, that's the evidence. And when we stop and examine it, the best explanation for that is the resurrection. And again, a reminder of just how important this is. This is the foundational aspect of Christianity, right? If we can get to the point where we believe the resurrection happened, man, that goes a long way into believing the rest of Christianity and even proving the rest of Christianity. So really important here. So the pagan myth theory, the substitute theory, and the stolen body theory are the three theories that the other three skeptic theories that we talk about. So we'll review these some next week, and you guys will have a quiz over the resurrection stuff, over the pieces of evidence for the resurrection and the skeptic theories for the resurrection. So maybe this weekend, go back and look over these worksheets, and kind of remind yourself of what these skeptic theories are, and then know how to give a response, how to pick out one or two things that you would respond to these theories with, because that'll kind of be what your quiz is next week. So that's all I got today. You guys have an awesome weekend. It's a long weekend. We get Monday off, and then hallelujah, I'll be back on Tuesday. I hope I say that. I hope I'll be back on Tuesday, barring any unforeseen changes in my quarantine or craziness that happens in life. But who knows, right? I'll be praying for you guys this weekend, and have a great long weekend, and I'll hopefully see you guys on Tuesday. See ya.